Hello and welcome to All There Is. I'm your host, Kelly Bargabas. Thanks for tuning in today. In this episode, I'm going to break down one of my favorite subjects and founding principles. I have some things that have been stirring in me for a while, and it's taken some effort to put words around what I've been witnessing, what I've been observing, and feeling about all of it. And that subject is compassion. It's a tenet that I hold in very high priority in my own life. I like to believe I'm a compassionate person. I think I am most of the time and in general. And compassion is vital in the human experience. We would be soulless, selfish monsters without it, right? Also, one of the tenets of this podcast, All There Is that we are here to witness the human experience. Compassion, based on its very definition, is the ultimate witness to human experience and specifically to human suffering. Being a witness to suffering is one of the most profound and really privileged things we engage in as human beings. I think Brene Brown had a quote that was something like this. She said, "My mother taught us to not look away when we encounter someone who is suffering or in grief. Look at them, witness it." And I always thought that was really powerful. And it's really hard for us, I think, sometimes to look people in the eye who are in pain because it's uncomfortable. To anchor us in this discussion, I'm going to start with some obvious things, like where does the word compassion come from? What is the etymology of it? The English noun compassion means to suffer together with, and it comes from Latin. Its prefix, com, comes directly from an archaic version of the Latin preposition that means with. The Oxford Dictionary says that compassion is defined as suffering together with another, participating in suffering, a fellow feeling of sympathy. I found this article from the Greater Good magazine with the headline, "What is compassion?" Compassion literally means to suffer together. Among emotion researchers, it is defined as the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. Cynics or skeptics may dismiss compassion as touchy-feely or irrational, but scientists have started to map the biological basis of compassion, suggesting its deep evolutionary purpose. Research has shown that when we feel compassion, our heart rate slows down, we secrete a bonding hormone, oxytocin, and regions of our brain that are linked to empathy, caregiving, and feelings of pleasure light up, which often results in our wanting to approach and care for other people. No surprises, right? Compassion is exactly what you and I thought it was. So what then? Why am I talking about it? Why do I think it's important enough to share in an episode? I've been noticing things lately in our world that cause me to question everything I know about this idea of compassion. And it has led me to this truth bomb. When compassion is compromised, it becomes cruel. If your compassion is compromised by ego, politics, political correctness, monetary gain, etc., then your actions can become cruel, even if they started with compassion. So let me explain what I mean, and I'm going to start at the beginning. I believe that compassion exists on a scale or comes in levels. And the first level or baseline of compassion is when we are confronted with the suffering of others. This triggers something that we feel. It hits us in our gut. It feels like a rock in our gut or in our chest or wherever we happen to feel those deep feelings. Maybe we get a lump in our throat, especially with human suffering. That is the first level of compassion. Remember the definition that I just shared with you. The first thing we do is we share in that suffering in a small way in our bodies and in our hearts and in our minds. It haunts us. If you're anything like me, sometimes when you see suffering, it can really haunt you. When you go to bed at night and close your eyes and you can't stop thinking about it. It is exactly why certain groups put those commercials on TV with the song "In the Arms of an Angel" by Sarah McLachlan. You know, those commercials with the animals, and it's really sad. Back in the day when I was young, it was Sally Struthers and starving children in Africa, and they would show the images of children who were emaciated, literally starving before our eyes with flies on their face. These commercials, these messages, these videos show the raw suffering. And why do they do that? Why do they show these horrible images to us? It's because they are intentionally trying to trigger compassion so that we feel something tangible, guttural, raw. Nonprofit organizations and charities do this all the time. I've done some of this work myself. I wrote a book about my brother for the sole purpose of raising awareness, which is necessary for people to see suffering that they had no idea was happening. This podcast is designed to build awareness about suffering and stories of real people that are happening that we might not have any clue about. I've done podcasts on babies born prematurely, postpartum OCD, children's interstitial lung diseases, deported veterans. I've done all these things to share and raise awareness so that I can trigger compassion in you. For some people, the momentum stops here. We aren't all moved by the same things. Different people can encounter the exact same situation and suffering, and one will be triggered to compassion and the other won't. For example, this is kind of a silly, lighthearted example, but I have no problem killing bugs and spiders. I really don't. I feel they are a threat, and so I will remove them from my home. Now, my father, who is very compassionate towards bugs, I'm not really sure why, he's been known to carry spiders and bugs out the front door and protect them on the journey so they can get out and live their best life. I feel the same way about mice. Like, if I see them in my house, I'm going to take them out. They are a threat to me. But I'm not completely soulless when it comes to rodents and small animals. The other day, I encountered baby birds on the sidewalk outside Marshall's, and I was stopped in my tracks. They had fallen from the nest. They were laying on the sidewalk. They were barely breathing. They were suffering. And I was frozen with compassion at the suffering I was witnessing, which was also compounded by this sense of helplessness because there was nothing I could do. And it was awful. It was like one of those things I saw and I just couldn't get the image out of my mind for a while. Just the cruelty of nature sometimes does get me, as long as it's not bugs, spiders, or mice. The reality is we encounter suffering or are confronted with the pain of others. And sometimes that's it. We stay in this level 1 of compassion and nothing further happens for you. You feel the feeling, you feel it in your body, you share that suffering by feeling those feelings, but you never really move on to the second level. And that's okay. The first level of compassion occurs when we are confronted with suffering, and I believe the majority of the human population participates in this first level. The second level of compassion is taking a step to alleviate the suffering. We see a dog being abused, and we rescue it and adopt it. We see children that are being abused or neglected, and we get involved. We take them in. My parents did this on an extreme level with my brother, which you can read about in the memoir, Chasing the Merry-Go-Round. They saw him being abused and being neglected, and they didn't think he was going to live. And so they took action, big time, and rescued him out of that home and brought him home to live with us. So in this second level of compassion, we take action if we can. Part of the definition of compassion is that it motivates you to alleviate the suffering. And this is exactly why all those organizations that I talked about in the first level want to keep the suffering in front of us. That's why they want to show us those videos. It's so that we will be motivated to take action. And this really is so important. And what I love about this phase of compassion is that it's wide open to many different perspectives or varieties of what that action looks like. There are some people who have a very extreme black and white view of taking action, which means that they think everyone should respond exactly like they do, and they get frustrated when they don't. But the truth is, we all have different things that take us to stage 2 on the compassion scale, right? For some, it is animals. For some, they devote their lives to rescuing and caring for and stopping the suffering of animals. I have a friend in California who is so passionate about relieving the suffering of abused dogs that she started a charity just to rescue dogs in that situation. PETA, right? The organization that is dedicated to protecting the safety and make sure that animals aren't suffering. They don't want any animals to be harmed. They are a little extreme sometimes, but necessary. For some people, it's children who need school supplies, or disabled children or adults, or children in the most poverty-stricken countries around the world. I've been on mission trips to Bungoma, Kenya a few times. My brother is in Honduras right now on a missions trip. I sit on the board of an organization called Marvelous Ways International, who takes action and goes wherever children and youth are suffering around the world to try to alleviate that suffering. Sometimes that action can also be in the form of financially supporting organizations. This happens every day, all around the world. People contribute and donate and give, and they really do need your money because alleviating suffering is expensive and somebody has to pay for it. But you can also volunteer yourself, your time, your resources, your skill set. You can foster a dog. You can get a rescue dog instead of paying for a fancy breed. You can provide a home to someone who needs it, whether it's a child, an adult, a friend. You can serve meals at a soup kitchen, or you can go out into the streets and relieve suffering in any way possible. One time when my husband and I lived in San Diego, we were so moved with compassion because San Diego has a major homeless problem. And one night we just made up bags and bags of sandwiches and took sandwiches and socks and handed them out on the streets. We weren't with a group. We weren't part of any organization. We were just really moved to do it. And so we took action. We were in this phase 2 of compassion and did it. All of this work is stage 2 on the compassion scale. What's important to note is that the sole purpose of taking action must be to alleviate the suffering. If it isn't, then your compassion has become compromised. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Also, the thing is about the scale of compassion is that we can be in different places depending on what we're talking about. For example, I have tremendous compassion for animals who are suffering, but I'm not really a big animal person. I have a dog. He is a rescue. If I ever get another dog, it will be a rescue, not a purchase breed. So that's the action I'm willing to take. I won't participate in ignoring the abuse of animals, and I'll support it by only having rescues, but that's pretty much where it stops for me. I don't feel moved to spend my life financially supporting PETA or the SPCA or opening a kennel or becoming a foster mom to rescues. It's just not, for me, that high on the scale. I will and have taken action for other things. People on the streets, people with invisible disabilities, children and youth around the world who are suffering in places with no safety nets, violence against women and children. I respond to these things in a much bigger way on the compassion scale. And I'm sure you have your things too. We all do. And that's okay. In fact, it's perfect because between all of us, we can alleviate all the suffering, right? I think it's really great that we all have our own little areas that really move us. Number 1 was being confronted, seeing the suffering, and experiencing that feeling of compassion in our bodies. The second level is taking action with the sole purpose of alleviating the suffering. As we increase on the scale of compassion, the impact gets bigger, but the purpose doesn't change. And the third phase, if we get there, and most people don't, we attempt to address the suffering at a mass level. We actually sign up. We take on the work to have a bigger impact. We seek out other dogs who are suffering beyond just the one we encountered. We start an organization. We start a shelter. We take on the burden, the obligation, the mission to shelter, clothe, feed, to triage, to deal with the day-to-day needs. That can show up in the form of refugee camps, if you're a safe harbor city for migrants, shelters for the homeless. The people in this phase of compassion are the ones who are signing up. They're raising their hands to say, come here, we'll shelter you, we'll feed you, we'll keep you safe. As we increase on the scale of compassion, the impact gets bigger, but the number of people who get here gets less and less. And it's not because we all don't care, we all do, but we all have limits as to how much we can take on, quite frankly, right? The fourth phase of compassion is prevention, right? It is preventing the suffering in the first place. It is trying to prevent one more family, one more person from ending up on the streets. And this shows up in our lives in all the safety nets that we've created in our society. It is public assistance. It is emergency funds for housing. It is soup kitchens and food pantries who provide groceries and food to people who have homes. They have some place to live, but they just don't have enough to feed their families for the whole month. And, those food pantries and those soup kitchens fill in the gap. It's a safety net so that they can keep paying their rent, keep that roof over their heads, right? That all falls under prevention. It's limiting how many pets people can own, breaking up illegal dog rings, screening people who adopt dogs. I know when I was young, anybody could go to the SPCA and get a dog. And now you have to fill out an application, you have to be interviewed, you have to agree that you'll provide certain things for those pets. All of that is in this area of prevention, right? Because we have people who've moved up the scale to this fourth level, and they are the watchdogs. They are trying to enact guidelines and rules and things, guardrails that keep the suffering from happening in the first place, right? And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But again, we have to remember that the sole goal here, because we're talking about compassion, is to alleviate the suffering. And if that gets compromised, then our actions can be cruel. I have a friend who works at a food pantry every week. She works really hard at this food pantry. They do a wonderful thing in the community that stems from compassion. They give out food to hundreds and hundreds of families on a weekly basis. There's been some rules put in place lately from the powers that be at the food bank that restrict who can come to the pantry. They have to live in certain zip codes, and they've put all these rules in place about who they can and cannot serve. And so now people are showing up to get food to feed their families, and they're being turned away. They're being turned away because of bureaucracy, because of rules. I would argue that somewhere along the line, the compassion got compromised. And maybe it got compromised because people were exploiting the system. There were some bad actors who were breaking the rules and ruining it for everybody. But again, we're on the compassion scale. So our number one goal in everything that we're doing should be to alleviate the suffering. And turning people away from taking food home to feed their families is not alleviating suffering. So that's just a recent example that I've had show up on my radar that was pretty, I don't know, it really struck me. The final phase on the compassion scale is where the smallest percentage of people get to. These are the ones motivated to resolve the suffering once and for all. They want solutions. They are problem solvers. They want to end it forever. The organization's trying to resolve homelessness, to resolve hunger for children and families everywhere. They are the ones who are enacting laws that prosecute animal abuse, violent acts against women and children. They are the ones who are ensuring and making laws so that there is affordable housing, treatment centers for addicts, and that people who are marginalized or at risk have help navigating the system of safety nets that we have put in place. I sit on the board of an organization called Marvelous Ways International, which I mentioned earlier, and that is exactly what they do. They are problem solvers, and they're trying to find big solutions to these societal problems so they can stop the suffering once and for all, and then duplicate that in many different communities around the world. I'm on that board for a reason, because that speaks to me. I tend to be a problem solver in my life. One of my goals is to really get involved in solving the problem of homelessness. I want to be a part of the solution, and I haven't figured out quite how to do that yet, but it's on my list. If you've hung in with me this far in this episode, what I want to circle back to is that in all of these stages, if your compassion remains uncompromised, then the outcome you are seeking will relieve suffering. And it's really important to ask those questions. Does the work you're doing elevate and lift that person out of the suffering that triggered your compassion in the first place? If the answer is no, then why are you doing it? Also, as you are relieving the suffering of one, are there ripple effects or collateral damage that is shifting the suffering to another person or group of people? If the answer is yes, your compassion is compromised. Your compassion is blind to the ripple suffering you are causing a new party. Tunnel vision that only allows you to see one person is compromised compassion. You have to make sure your alleviation of suffering isn't creating or compounding suffering somewhere else. Now, I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir, and everyone listening to this is like, duh, I know that. So why did I share this today? Well, because what I've witnessed as I look around, allowing those people to waste away on our public streets in front of our eyes while we avoid looking at them, while we step over them or and around them, that's not compassion. We walk by and some of us feel a tug, maybe stop and give money. Some are disgusted or afraid, but all of it is not compassion. It's not compassion to allow or encourage people to stay in their suffering. It's not compassion to protect suffering. The ripple effect of our decisions at the leadership level, at the city level, state, country, on the most marginal among us, we have to look at this through the lens of uncompromised compassion. Our decisions will move us toward compassion, or it will keep us stuck in the cycle of human suffering. And I believe wholeheartedly, it is not a crime to be homeless or addicted or ill, but it's also not compassion to let people suffer in those things at their expense. Maybe our expense too. We all lose. But I also want to be part of the solution. I want to be part of level 5, the resolution. And I think we can solve this in our lifetime. For me, I think it starts with spreading the message in this podcast and confronting our compromised compassion and calling it out as cruel and moving forward from there. So that was my goal today, was to just get you thinking about it. I don't think that most of us everyday people have compromised compassion. I think something happens when it grows and it gets bigger on the scale and the influence and the impact gets bigger. It's sort of human nature that ego gets involved, that politics get involved, that political correctness gets involved. And so I'm sharing this today so you are aware, so we are all aware, so we can keep ourselves in check and also our leaders, and so that we can keep our actions in check as individuals, as a community, as a country. Compromised compassion is cruel. True compassion alleviates suffering. It doesn't protect and allow the suffering to continue. It also doesn't cause suffering to ripple to other people. We can't alleviate suffering at the expense of others. As you encounter suffering and witness the attempt to alleviate it, keep your compassion uncompromised and require your leaders to do the same. We have to find a better way, and we have to hold our leaders accountable to find that better way with us. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. You can go to kellybargabas.com to find all past episodes. If you like this podcast, share, subscribe, review it. Until we meet again, take care.